Good morning, everybody. My name is Crystal Holloman. I'm a digital reporter here at News 10. We're going to take you right now to Pontiac, Michigan, to a courtroom where the trial of James Crumbley is entering day 3. The defendant there on the far left just walked into court and sat down. So again, this is day 3 of the trial of James Crumbley, father of Ethan Crumbley, who was sentenced earlier this year for the Oxford High School shooting that killed 4 students. So let's listen in.
Mr. Crumbley, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Oh, the jury's coming.
Yeah, of course.
Sure, you have pens? Okay. Sam.
Thank you, Judge.
All rise for the jury.
Good morning, you can be seated. We really appreciate you being on time, and I hope you've had a nice, media-free weekend, and we're going to proceed. Prosecutor, who's the next witness?
Sean Hopkins.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth to help you God?
I do.
Okay, please step up and have a seat. And just state your name for the record and spell your first and last name.
Sean, S-H-A-W-N, Hopkins, H-O-P-K-I-N-S.
Go ahead, prosecutor.
Thank you. Sir, how are you?
I'm here.
Sir, do you work for the Oxford School District?
I have been employed for the Oxford School District. I am currently on leave at this moment.
Now, I'd like to direct your attention specifically to the fall of 2021. Were you working with Oxford School District at that point?
Yes, I was.
In what role?
I was a counselor in Oxford High School.
Okay. And tell us, please, what general duties are associated with that particular role?
I managed a caseload of about 400 students. With that, I was in charge of scheduling for those students, preparing them for life after high school by helping them kind of look through different potential job opportunities, caring for social emotional wellness for students, and being kind of just a general person who would be consistent throughout their time in high school working with them.
Okay. You said you had a caseload of about 400 students?
Yes.
How many students went to Oxford High School at that particular time?
There were approximately 1,800 students. Divided amongst 4 counselors, there were 1,600, and then approximately 200 in an early college program as well.
So in November of 2021, approximately how long had you been employed with Oxford High School?
I started as an intern in 2014 and was hired full-time in fall of 2015.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your background, please.
I came out of college, graduated with a degree in youth ministry, worked as a youth pastor starting in 2009, and then did that and went back to school for a master's degree in counseling. I graduated with that, actually walked in December of 2014 and started working in the high school thereafter.
Okay. Now you mentioned your role included helping students transition into post-secondary either education or employment, scheduling, as well as social, emotional issues.
Yes.
Would one of those roles take precedence?
It would ebb and flow depending on the time of year, but there was never anything that you did that was, this is the most important thing because it was what student you were with at the time.
Okay.
To a senior going to college, helping them with that college application took precedence in that moment. To a student sitting in front of you with social emotional needs, that took precedence in that moment.
So, did you have regular check-ins with students, or was it an as-needed basis?
It depended on what it was for. We did have regular meetings with students in regards to scheduling, but when it came to social emotional, that was more of an as-needed basis.
Did your role as a counselor involve disciplining students?
No,
Okay, who took care of that?
that would have been the dean or our administration,
Okay. In November of 2021, who was the dean?
Nikki Jack.
All right. And did you work with him a lot?
No, I didn't. He was actually new to the district that year.
Okay. So, is there a reason why the counselor would be separate from the discipline of students?
The counselor's role was to be a student advocate, to remain on the side of the student through difficult situations oftentimes, to give the student somebody that they could build that trust and rapport with, where the dean would be enforcing code of conduct.
Okay. What code of conduct? What's that?
The standards that are expected to be followed by students.
Okay, so a rule. Would that be fair?
That would be a part of it,
Okay.
yes. Yes.
Now, in the fall of 2021, was Oxford High School in person, hybrid, or remote?
Oxford High School was in person.
Okay. Were all students and teachers wearing face masks at that point?
Yes, they were.
In the fall of 2021, what sort of issues would you face with the students' social emotional health?
Social emotional health was definitely on our radar in the fall of 2021. Coming out of COVID, coming out of time being out from school, the anxiety that was associated with that time period, we saw a lot of issues for students, whether it be anxiety, whether it be depression, and in a few cases, it was suicide attempts.
Now, that year, did you encounter any students who actually had attempted suicide?
I did,
How many?
at least 4.
Sir, are you familiar with the term suicidal ideation?
Yes, I am familiar with that term.
Could you please explain to us what that means?
Suicidal ideation
Yeah, I'm
is...
going to object to relevance.
Judge, I believe this witness will testify that he indicated that the defendant's son was expressing signs of suicidal ideation that was expressed to the defendant.
Well, that was his belief at the time, right? So I'm going to allow it.
Thank you. What's suicidal ideation?
Suicidal ideation is looking at themes, ideas, behaviors which could be associated with suicide. So when you take sadness, depression, anxiety, those on their own aren't necessarily suicidal. And when we look at them, we may see somebody who's not actively suicidal, that may not be expressing a date or a plan or a method, but we see themes that, if left unchecked, could be associated with potentially becoming suicidal.
Okay. Now, as your role as a counselor at Oxford High School, as you dealt with students who were expressing suicidal ideation separate from those who actually attempted suicide,
Yes,
could you put a number on how many?
dozens.
Now, you mentioned that there were 4 counselors for a school of around 1,700, 1,800 or so. How was it that each student was assigned to a counselor?
Of the students who are not in the early college program, they were divided out alphabetically amongst their counselors.
Was James Crumbley's son one of the students assigned to your caseload in November of 2021?
Yes.
Is James Crumbley in court today?
Yes, he
Could
is.
you please point to him and describe something he's wearing today?
He is seated at this table wearing a suit coat with a blue tie.
Your Honor, would the record reflect identification of the defendant?
The record would reflect the in-court identification of the defendant, James Crumbley.
Sir, when is the first time that you would have interacted with James Crumbley's son?
The first time that I likely interacted with him would have been scheduling during his freshman year.
Okay, so for context, November of 2021, he was a sophomore, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, so this would have been August or September of 2020?
No. When students are in 8th grade, they're scheduled at the middle school level. I
Okay.
may or may not have been in his classroom because it's divided out within their 8th grade classrooms. And we're not really we don't know the students at all at that point.
Okay.
I would have done scheduling with him during his freshman year, approximately February of 2021.
February of 21.
Yes.
Okay.
Those meetings were done virtually, and were not in depth, and were only to discuss their next year's schedule.
Do you remember anything about that meeting if you
I
had it?
don't remember that meeting in particular, no.
Now I'm going to show you. First of all, if you recall, when is the next time that you had any interaction with the defendant's son?
I don't recall this particular meeting, but I know that there was a phone call in spring of 2021
Okay.
from a teacher to me, and then I called into the student's classroom to meet with the student.
Okay.
I do not remember that meeting.
All right, I'm going to show you what's been admitted as Exhibit 198. This is an email, May 13, 2021, 1:46 in the afternoon. Without telling us that person's name, who was that person who sent you the email?
Without telling,
Well, who does she work there at Oxford High School?
she was an English teacher at
English
Oxford
teacher,
High School.
okay. And the email is, "Hi, when you get a chance, can you call the defendant's son down and see how he's doing? He is failing my class and tries to sleep all the time. In class, thanks." That's Exhibit 198, May 13, 2021. You received this email?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And the response from you at 2:07 p.m. is, "I'll catch him before the end of the day." And then her response at 2:08 was, "Thanks, just a little worried." Okay, did you have any interaction with the defendant's son because of this email?
I have, through phone records, I called into a student's classroom and called him down to my office. I don't
Okay.
remember that particular meeting.
Okay. But at least your recollection is that you would have had that meeting.
The evidence from everything suggests that I had that meeting.
Sure, that's fair. Did you contact either James or Jennifer Crumbley then?
I did not.
Okay. And why or why not?
It was a check-in, and it didn't raise to the level of concern where I would contact a parent.
Now, as a counselor with Oxford High School, did you have a sort of method or protocol for when you determine when to contact a parent?
There isn't a set, there isn't always a set level of when you do it, but when something becomes repeated or when something becomes more concerning, I am going to then involve a parent.
Okay. Are grades available to parents on a district-wide basis?
Yes, they are. They are available through a system called Power School, which is available online
Okay, and that's the system that a parent can log in daily if they would choose to.
as often as they would like.
Now, the next interaction you had with the defendant's son would be September 2021?
I did not actually have an interaction with the defendant's son. I received information about the defendant's son.
Okay, I'm showing you Exhibit 199. This is an email from a different teacher to you, September 8, 2021?
Yes.
Okay. And why don't you go ahead and read the email here that you received?
Hi, Sean. Could you please touch base with student? In his autobiography poem, he said that he feels terrible and that his family is a mistake. Unusual responses for sure.
Okay, that is September the 8th, 2021. Do you recall any interaction with the defendant's son at that point?
I do not.
Okay. Now, do you recall any meetings, check-ins, or phone calls from September to November of 2008 or 2021?
No. So to give context on this, what I did was have a conversation with the teacher to gain a little more context of what was meant by the email. And then the teacher filled me in that the student was actually joking with others in the class, and that it was not at the level of concern that she had believed when she sent the email.
Okay, so if I'm correct, then you received the email, then you made contact with the teacher who sent you the email?
Yes.
Okay, and then the determination was made that no further involvement was required?
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's... Oh, this is your response. Thanks for the heads up. I'm in senior meetings throughout the day, but we'll try and catch up with him. That was to the same teacher, September 8, 2021, 9:15.
Yes, that is correct.
This is People's Exhibit 200. This is November the 10th, 2021. The same teacher emailed you, "Hi, Sean. the defendant's son is having a rough time right now. He might need to speak with you. Do you recall that email?
I do.
Okay. And tell us what you did when you received that email.
I checked in with the student in the hallway in between classes to just let them know that if they were having a hard time, that I was available to talk to.
Okay. And here's your response at 4:44 p.m. I'm sorry, I was in a meeting through the end of the day. I'll catch up with them.
Yes.
So you recall that interaction with the defendant's son?
Yes.
Okay, tell us about that, please.
It was in between classes. I believe the morning after I had responded to this email. And I just spoke to him briefly in passing to let him know that if he needed to talk for any reason, that I would make myself available for him.
Okay. Did you make a decision to contact a parent at that point?
I did not.
Okay. You did not contact a parent?
I did not contact a parent.
And tell us why, please.
Because I wanted to gain any information from the student and allow the student the opportunity to talk. Being sad isn't unusual, but if I had no information other than the student is sad, it's not something I would call a parent over.
Now, when's the next time you had any interaction with the defendant's son?
November 29th.
Right, I'm going to show you what's been admitted as People's 201. This is an email from a teacher to Mr. Ejak and Ms. Fine, and you eventually were CC'd on this email?
I was forwarded this email.
Okay.
Yes.
And the email says, "Good morning, I had a student during first hour today," the defendant's son, who was on his phone looking at different bullets at the end of first hour today as I was walking around the room passing out their essays. I didn't get a chance to investigate it a bit further since it was the end of the hour. Now that he's on my radar, I'm also noticing some of his previous work that he's completed from earlier in the year leans a bit toward the violent side. I can bring down these things later today during my 5th hour prep if you would like them." And then it was forwarded to you at 9:34 a.m.?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And then your response was, "Thanks, Jacqueline, I'll be touching base with him as well."
Yes.
Okay, and tell us what happened with this, please.
I ended up going down to Miss Fine's office, who was on the initial email.
So who's Ms. Fine?
She was our restorative practices coordinator
Okay.
at that time. And she called the student down to her office to chat about the email that had been sent.
Were you present for that meeting?
I was present for that meeting.
Okay, and tell us about that, please.
The student came down towards the end of the second class of the day, and Ms. Fine led the meeting. I was there to be a support for the student in case it became a disciplinary issue, but it was very cordial.
We say support for the student in case it became a disciplinary issue. That's not for you to discipline, correct?
That is correct. I would be there just as somebody who's able to be a comfort to the student
Okay.
during a time where they may potentially be experiencing discipline.
Now, at that point, was everybody wearing a COVID face mask?
Yes, they were.
And in fact, had you ever interacted with the defendant's son without a COVID face mask?
No, I did not.
So you said Ms. Fine led the meeting? I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Yes, Ms. Fine did lead the meeting. She had a conversation with the student about the email that was received and led it in a way to see if the student would bring any information available based on what the email was received, where she asked him, "Were you looking at anything in class? Were you looking at, what teacher were you looking at this information in class?" to see if he would acknowledge that it was Ms. Kavina who sent the email. He did. He was compliant during that meeting. And the conversation centered around how it was not school appropriate. The student understood, or at least stated he understood, and was returned to class. A phone call was then placed to the student's mom from Ms. Fine.
Okay, and we heard that last week during the trial. That was from Ms. Fine to Jennifer Crumbley?
That is correct.
Okay, and was that a voicemail that was left?
It was left as a voicemail, yes.
Did the defendant's son indicate that he had received a gun for Christmas a few days before?
No.
So what happened next?
In terms of that meeting,
Yes.
the meeting was over, he returned to class.
How long was the meeting?
5 to 10 minutes.
Now, in the realm of either discipline or your role as a counselor, what does it take to move from a check-in to a phone call home?
It can be subjective. Oftentimes it would be if there's information we feel that is necessary for parents to know. Somewhere it's obvious as if you feel the student may be a threat to himself, or if there's any potential that that could be a possibility. If you have concerning information that the student has shared. Or it could just be simply to confirm what a student has said is true.
Okay. So that's a phone call home. What does it take to actually call the parents in for a meeting immediately?
I would have to have a high level of concern that needed parental involvement.
And when was the next time you had any interaction with the defendant's son?
November 30th.
Okay, so that would be Tuesday the next day?
Yes.
All right. So let's talk about the 30th. I'm going to show you People's Exhibit 202. This is an email on Tuesday, November 30th, 2021, 8:05 a.m. From a teacher to you, Ms. Fine. Good morning. I know Jackie emailed you guys yesterday with some concerns about the defendant's son in our first hour class. Today he's watching videos on his phone of a guy gunning down people. It looks like it's a movie scene and not security footage / a real event, but definitely still concerning when taking into account some of his other behaviors. Just wanted to keep you guys updated. Do you recall receiving that email?
I do.
Do you remember when you received it?
It was sent at 8:05. I believe I saw it approximately 20 to 30 minutes later.
Okay. And what was your reaction when you received this email?
My initial reaction was frustration of a student that just had a conversation about school-appropriate behavior. And I wanted to make sure that I met with him.
Okay. So this is Exhibit 203. This is from another teacher to you at 9:32 a.m. Again, Tuesday, November 30th. Here's the photo I took of his paper in case you need it, with a picture of a math assignment. Now, what happened in between the time you saw this email, it was sent at 8:05, to this email sent at 9:32?
So I was on the phone with other parents at the time I received the first email. And when I was done with that phone call, at that time, Mr. Ejak actually was in my office as I was wrapping up the phone call.
Okay.
He had been presented with a picture of the math assignment from the math teacher and wanted to make sure I was involved in that
This picture?
conversation. I don't know exactly what it was. I know he was showing a picture on a cell phone.
Okay.
I would believe it was the initial one, but I do not know that for a fact. I never saw the cell phone.
That's fair.
So he wanted to involve me in a conversation with the student about the math assignment, and I wanted to talk to the student about the email that had been sent that morning. I do not know if he was on that email, Mr. Ejak was on that email about the watching the video or not.
Okay. So we talked about the email from that morning. We're referring to this email regarding
Yes.
the video.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is the information I had at the time that I was making a decision to meet with the student, and Mr. Ejak had the information that there was a math assignment with something on it.
So at the time that you decided to meet with the defendant's son, you hadn't even seen this picture yet?
That is correct.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
when Mr. Ejak came and mentioned that there was something going on with the student, I made the decision that I was going to go to the math class and retrieve the student. It's less concerning oftentimes for a counselor to walk into a class than a dean, because I could be talking about 50 different things with the student.
Okay.
So it just isn't going to raise suspicion for others. So I went to the class and asked the student if he could come with me, and I grabbed the math assignment as part of it.
So you grabbed the math assignment. So it was been admitted as Exhibit 128. Now this math assignment looks different than the one that was emailed to you. Did you receive an explanation as to why?
I didn't know there was a difference initially because for the first 30 minutes, all I had was the actual physical copy.
And that would be this in Exhibit 128?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So as I was meeting with the student in the office, I had the email about what had been sent about watching videos, and I had the copy that is currently on the screen of the math assignment. So I initially asked the student, what was it that you were watching in class? Why am I receiving an email from a teacher one day after I know you just had a conversation about what's appropriate in school and what's not? The student told me he was watching a video game on his phone. Not uncommon, also not school appropriate, especially given the context of what we had just had in the conversation.
Okay.
So we had a conversation about making that good choice and making wise choices. And then I grabbed the math assignment and I put it in between the student and I. So Mr. Ejak was actually in that meeting as well. He sat kind of off to my right. The student was across from me, across from my desk. And I asked him, okay, so we can talk about, making good choices in the classroom, but let's talk about this. And I put the assignment in between us.
And what stood out to you when you saw this?
Well, I wanted him to explain it to me, but some of the things that actually stood out to me the most were what was written on it. Because I read something like, the thoughts won't stop, and I could read help me underneath it being crossed out.
Is this the part right here that I'm highlighting?
Yes.
Okay.
I read harmless act. I saw what looked like one body, and my initial concern was that this student's drawing some things that lead me to think he might hurt himself.
Okay.
So I asked him to explain what's on here, because I didn't want it to just be me interpreting what he wrote. I wanted to hear what he had to say about it. And he told me initially that it was a video game, that he liked drawing video game characters, liked that area of entertainment, and that he wanted to go into video game design. So then I told him, okay, you can tell me that, but let's explain these words. Here you write, the thoughts won't stop. Here you write, harmless act. And here you write, I'd have to look at it, I think it was like, my life is useless, or something like that, where he crossed it out.
This part that's highlighted right here?
Yeah, and I said, that doesn't sound like a video game to me.
So I take it then you didn't accept his explanation of the video game?
Not in totality, no, because I wanted to gain more context.
So did you make a decision at that point to do something?
Well, as he continued talking, he then started talking about things that were going on in his life.
What do you mean things that are going on?
Well, he mentioned that school's been tough during COVID, that a family member had passed recently. A family dog had died. He said a friend moved away. And as he was talking, I just kept hearing all these themes of sadness.
What was his demeanor like?
Appropriately sad. It matched what he was saying.
Okay.
And so at that point, I told him, okay, this is a lot that you've got going on, and I want to make sure that we get you help. And so I told him, when I hear all of this, what I do is I'm going to call a parent. And I asked him, is there a parent you'd rather I call? He told me mom would probably be easier to get a hold of. So I called mom first and left a voicemail. This would have been approximately 20 to 25 minutes after the meeting started.
Okay.
So at this point, I just decided that it was enough that I wanted to involve a parent.
All right. And you said you called mom first and left a voicemail.
I did.
Did you also call the defendant, James Crumbley?
I did, and it was right after leaving a voicemail. I'm not entirely sure if he answered or not. I think he did, but it was almost like there was just air on the other end.
Okay.
So I wasn't able to leave a message or anything. Mom then called me back a few minutes later, and we talked for, I would guess, 5 or 6 minutes. She was on speakerphone with her son for a brief part of that conversation, and I asked her to please be able to come in, that I had some concerns I wanted to go over. I texted her.
Did you specify those concerns?
Well, I texted her a picture of the math assignment, and by that time I also then received the email that I think you put up earlier of the math assignment.
By this point in time, this was 9:32 a.m. that Ms. Morgan sent it. Was the defendant's son already in your office at that point?
Yes.
Okay. And then, did you have a chance to look at this picture as well?
I looked briefly at it, but I was already on the phone with Mom at that point.
Okay, this is Exhibit 130. This is what we refer to as the original drawing.
Okay.
And you said you were on the phone with Jennifer Crumbley at that point?
Yeah, so I emailed her then the original drawing as well.
Okay, so you sent this to the student's mother?
Yes.
Okay. And did you have a chance to look at this?
I did look at it. Most of it confirmed what I thought was under the scribble outs, and I also noticed some words were added.
Okay. What words stood out to you?
What do you mean?
When you said words were added, what did you notice?
On the one where he added words, I know he added like OHS rocks, or we're all friends here, which I kind of took as just a 15-year-old writing things. It didn't.
So you're referring to this Exhibit 128, some additional words?
Yes, he added video game this is, OHS rocks. I think I Love My Life So Much was added.
Okay.
Things that were facetious.
And that was after he was seen with this, is that correct? It was after he created this, Exhibit 130?
Yes, it existed in its form as Exhibit 130 prior to the edits that I had seen on the paper.
Now, at some point, did both James and Jennifer Crumbley come to your office?
Yeah, so I ended up being on the phone with Mom for that 5 to 6 minutes. She stated she was going to try and get Dad to come to the office, that she was unable to. And so during that point, we had about 20 minutes where I was sort of just waiting. During that time, I showed the student the list of resources I was going to give to his parents.
Tell me about that, please.
It was about a 3-page list of just different mental health services in the area. On it, it gave contact information for them. It gave specialization areas for them. And it gave oftentimes insurance, if it was accepted, if they worked without insurance, anything that they would work with, payment plans.
Okay.
So I wanted him to see what I would be providing his parents.
Was the defendant's son with you from the point that you brought him out of class to the point that James and Jennifer Crumbley arrived at school?
Yes.
Okay. And approximately how long was that?
It was approximately an hour and a half. So around, I want to say a little before 10, probably like 9:45, 9:50, I received another call from Mom stating that she was unable to get a hold of Dad and that she would be coming in.
Okay. Now, if I told you that we saw surveillance video that indicated you welcomed them, both James and Jennifer, in your office at 10:40 a.m., does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay. Now, what was your expectations of what was to happen at the end of that meeting?
My hope was that they were going to take him and either take him to get help or even just to take him to let's have a good day. Let's have a day where we just spend time with you, where we are with you.
To take him out of school?
Yeah.
Did you believe that he could be left alone at that point?
I didn't want him left alone. I didn't want to make that decision that he was okay to be left alone. So that's why I stayed with him for as long as I did, until I had parents there.
Did you express to the student or his parents that you identified suicidal ideation?
Yes, I said that the student, when I asked the student if he had a plan, if he was a threat to himself or others, the student said, his words were something to the effect of, I can see why this looks bad, I'm not going to do anything. So I had all of this information, but the student was saying he wasn't going to be doing anything. So when the parents came in, I went over all of the things I had seen over my time with the student. That he expressed the sadness over a dog passing. He expressed that COVID has been hard, that a family member passed, that a friend left. He expressed an argument the night before with parents.
Did he tell you details about the argument?
No.
Did he tell you that he received the gun a few days ago?
No.
Tell us about the meeting when James and Jennifer arrived.
It was initially odd to me that they were both there because I wasn't expecting that. But not to the point where I asked anything about it, just it was unexpected. Both parents followed me back to my office. The student, that was the one time he was in there by himself, was when I went out to greet the parents and brought them back. The student and his dad sat across from me, and mom sat in a chair kind of diagonal from me. And Mr. Ejak had left once we had confirmed parents were coming, and he returned for that portion of the meeting. So really, I felt like parents were confirming what I had said without giving additional information.
Hang on, let me ask you about that. You say confirming without giving additional information. I want to make sure I understand what you mean by that. So first of all, you've had these kind of meetings with parents in the past?
I have.
Okay. When you say confirming, is that something that would typically happen in these meetings?
It could, but oftentimes you may gain additional information. As you know, as a school employee, I had 90 minutes.
Okay.
He's 15 years old.
So did James or Jennifer give you any additional information?
No.
Okay. So tell me what you did and what was said.
So to start off the meeting, I asked Mom if she had received the phone call from the previous day and that those events were true. She said yes. I talked about how the student had expressed these different areas of sadness, that his dog had passed, yes. Family member had passed, yep. Friends left. And all of those were just confirmed.
Were there any details about the circumstances of the friend leaving and the impact on their son?
I didn't know any details about it. No.
They didn't share any with you?
No.
Okay. I'm sorry. I interrupted again. Go ahead.
It's okay. So a lot of it was, I felt like I was bringing information and they knew it, but I wasn't gaining information. So at that point, I know I handed Mom the list of resources and said I'd like him to get support outside of here. I'd like him to get help and have somebody that he can talk to. And Mom made mention that they would, but they couldn't right away. So I told Mom that I wanted him to get help as soon as possible, today if possible, and was told that wasn't possible.
Okay. Told by James, Jennifer, or both?
By Jennifer.
Okay.
James at that time, to my memory, was talking with his son.
Do you recall what he said?
I remember it, yes. He was looking at the math assignment with his son.
When you say math assignment, are we talking about
It's
this one?
the hard copy.
So we're referring to this, Exhibit 128?
Yes.
Okay.
And he was talking to his son and mentioned that, you know, you have people you can talk to. You can talk to your counselor, you have your journal, we talk. And it felt appropriate at that time, but...
At that point, did he share any details about anything you had discussed?
I don't recall any additional details, no. But my concern at that point was that there wasn't any action happening.
When his wife said that they can't, did he protest that?
No.
So you said you had a concern that no action was happening, so what did you decide to do?
Well, I told them that with getting help, I said I wanted to see movement on within 48 hours, and that I'd be following up.
So if the shooting didn't occur, what was your plan?
I was going to meet with the student the next morning and see if they had had conversations about it, if they had made some plans to move towards some sort of therapy.
And if that didn't occur, what were you going to do?
I was going to call Child Protective Services.
Now, generally speaking, within Oxford High School, is it preferred to send the student home when an issue arises, or keep the student at school?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean with that.
So you didn't call the police?
As a counselor, I can't send a student home anyway.
But you didn't want him to be alone?
I didn't want him to be alone. So in this context, my thought was when parents were saying they had to return to work, I wanted to make sure the student was with people. Because my concern was him, was his well-being and his ability to be safe and cared for.
Did James Crumbley elaborate at all on the fight they had the night before?
No.
Now, how long did tell us how the meeting ended.
Jennifer asked if they were done, which felt abrupt. And during that time, the student had also expressed interest. He wanted to go back to class. I asked Mr. Ejak if there was any, like from a discipline standpoint, is there anything you need to do? Is there any reason he can't go to class? And I was told no. So I wrote him a pass to return to his end of his third hour.
Okay. When Jennifer asked, are we done here, did James protest at all?
No.
So tell us what happened as you wrote the student a pass.
I told the student that I cared about him and wanted him to know that I just wanted him to know that.
Did either James or Jennifer say that to him?
No.
Mr. Hopkins, do you have any knowledge of firearms?
Very limited.
Would you know what this firearm depicts? What kind of firearm?
A handgun.
Is that the extent of your knowledge?
Yeah.
What about this bullet here?
A bullet.
Just a bullet? And neither James nor Jennifer said anything about the firearm or the bullet?
No.
Now, you indicated that you passed on a 3-page list of resources for mental health providers.
I did.
I'm going to show you a screenshot of 137 here. In James's hand, does this appear to be that list of resources?
Objection. I would say that calls for speculation. I don't think Mr. Hopkins knows what's in Mr. Crumbley's hand.
Do you know what's in his hand?
I know that it's multiple pages of paper, and I handed him a stapled 3-page piece of paper.
Okay. Did you see anything in Jennifer Crumbley's hands?
I do not. Well, a phone. And something in her right hand, but I'm not sure. Maybe. I see a phone.
Now, in years as a high school counselor, how many times have you had to call a parent in and tell either mom or dad or guardian that you identified suicidal ideation in their child?
15 to 20, over a dozen.
Okay. Any of those meetings, did a parent fail to take their child home?
I can't think of any, no.
Now, you indicated this was a confirming responses from James and Jennifer Crumbley. In those other meetings, were parents sharing information?
Oftentimes, yes. oftentimes parents would come in and want to paint a more complete picture of their student, of their situation. Oftentimes, all the time, I feel parents know their kids better than I do. If all I ever did was meet with students, I might have 2 hours a year with each student.
Do you rely upon the parent for that information?
Absolutely.
I've got nothing further. Thank you, Judge.
Ross?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Hawkins.
Good morning.
I'm going to go back to your first interactions with Mr. Crumbley's son. I'm not going to use his name, so if for some reason the way that I'm referring to his son confuses you, just let me know. If we're using too many he's, does that make sense?
Okay, I will do that.
Thank you. So your first interactions with Mr. Crumbley's son were in the fall of 2020.
Well, fall of 2020. No, it would have been spring of 2021.
Okay, so it would have been before the 2021 school year.
Yes.
And that was for planning his class schedule, is that correct?
That would have been the main reason that we would have met with every freshman. And then I had that email that was displayed earlier from his English teacher.
The May of 2021 email.
Yes.
And after that May of 2021 email, you didn't specifically recall having a meeting with Mr. Crumbley's son.
I don't have memory of that meeting, no.
In fact, you went back and reviewed your records and determined that there appears to have been a phone call. That you called him down to your office?
I called into his class and called him down to my office.
Okay. But you don't remember ever meeting with him?
I don't remember the meeting.
You did not contact Mr. Crumbley or his wife after that May of 2021 email?
That is correct.
So other than discussing Mr. Crumbley's son's class schedule with him, and then maybe meeting with him in May of 2021 about that email, you don't recall any additional interactions with Mr. Crumbley's son before November 10th of 2021?
That is correct.
In September of 2021, you received another email from a teacher which was displayed, I believe it was Exhibit 199, which would be an email from a teacher talking about a poem. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that he had a class assignment of writing an autobiography poem.
And he had said to that teacher he'd made some concerning statements in that poem.
Yeah, so if I can give a little more context to this was actually a Spanish class, so the poem wouldn't have even been in English.
Okay. So he used words in Spanish?
That is my understanding after talking to the teacher.
And the Spanish teacher had concerns about the Spanish words that he used?
That is my understanding based on the email. I also followed up with the teacher and gained further context about it.
Right, and as a result of gaining further context, you were not concerned?
Because the teacher lowered the level of concern for me, yes.
So even though your response that you were going to catch up with Mr. Crumbley's son, even though that's in the email, you didn't actually meet with him because you had the conversation with the teacher?
That is correct.
Again, you didn't notify James Crumbley or his wife about the teacher's concern in September of 2021?
No, I did not.
And you didn't forward them the email?
No.
And that was because in your mind, based on the information that you had, there was nothing to be concerned about?
Well, I just gained further context from the teacher and made the decision based off of that information.
And had no concerns?
I think that you're putting those words in to make it a little more extreme, but what I would say is I gained context and made a decision based off of that.
And if you had been concerned, if you had had sufficient concern, you would have reached out to Mr. Crumbley or his wife?
If it had raised the level of concern where I felt I needed to, I would have, yes.
So then on November 10th of 2021, you received another email from a different teacher?
From the same teacher.
Oh, thank you for correcting me. It was the same teacher. She asked you to check in with Mr. Crumbley's son on November 10th.
She said he might need to speak with you.
And she said that she believed he was having a hard time.
She said he's having a rough time right now. He might need to speak with you.
The next day, you responded and indicated that you would check in with him.
Later that evening, after the school day was over, I responded, I believe.
So you obviously couldn't have met with him that day because the school day was over, correct?
She sent the email at the end of the school day, and I responded approximately 2 hours after the end of the school day.
So you couldn't have met with him that day because the school day was over. Is that fair?
He would not have been there.
So you would have met with him the next day.
Yes.
And do you believe that you did meet with him on November 11th?
Yes.
You spoke with him in the hallway?
Yes, I caught him in between classes.
You simply told him that you were available if he needed to talk?
Yes.
There was no further discussion with him at that time?
No, because the way the email was written was that he might need to speak with you. So I just wanted to let him know that there was an opening if he wanted to speak with me.
And having a rough time, like the teacher indicated in her email on November 10th, having a rough time isn't necessarily something that raises red flags. Is that fair?
I didn't have any other context as to what was going on, and I just wanted to offer a chance for the student to speak if he needed to do so.
And his response, if you recall, was something along the lines of, okay, thanks, okay. And I'm not asking you to quote him because I don't know if you remember, but it was not an uncommon response. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it was a normal response given the situation.
You did not email James Crumbley or his wife about that November 10th email, correct?
I did not email them, no.
Or the November 11th brief meeting with their son.
Correct.
You did not forward that email to Mr. Crumbley or his wife.
I did not.
So then the next interaction that you had with Mr. Crumbley's son was on November 29th of 2021, and that was a Monday, if you recall?
Yes, that would have been a Monday.
You were forwarded another email that was sent to Nicholas Ejak and Pamela Fine, is that correct?
Yes, I was.
And this is the third email you've received from a teacher since this school year began, if you recall.
Yes, it would have been.
September of 21, November 10th of 2021, and now November 29th of 2021. The email advised that Mr. Crumbley's son was looking at bullets on his phone at the end of class.
Could I see the email?
Yes. Exhibit 201.
This is just the forward, so it doesn't have the actual email in it.
You were advised that that was the concern, was that Mr. Crumbley's son was looking at bullets on his phone.
I believe that to be true, but this email you have on the screen isn't the one that says that.
Correct. The email doesn't say it, but you were aware that that's why the teacher was concerned,
Could
and
I
that's why
see
the
that
teacher was
email?
emailing. I don't know if that's in the email.
That email was displayed earlier, I think. It was sent to Mr. Ejak and Ms. Fine.
That was the one.
It's at the
Unless it's-
bottom.
Oh, there we
it
go.
is. Thank
There
you.
we go. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is the email I was forwarded. And it just was at the end of the hour. The teacher didn't get a chance to really find out what was going on, but it just glanced at it and had seen that.
And I'll leave that up in case you need to look at it.
Thank you.
So you were aware that on November 29th of 2021, at the time you received this forwarded email, that Mr. Crumbley's son was looking at bullets on his phone in class.
Yes, after reading this email, I was aware.
At some point, well, let me go in order. Shortly after this email, you then met with Mr. Crumbley's son and Pamela Fine.
Yes.
And you met in your office or Ms. Fine's office?
It was in Ms. Fine's office.
And you were there just as support, but Ms. Fine did most of the talking. Is that fair?
Yes, I would say that was fair.
And Ms. Fine talked to Mr. Crumbley's son about looking at bullets on his phone?
She did. She actually asked him to describe why would a teacher be contacting me right now. And the student was forthcoming in what had happened in class.
He was forthcoming. He was honest, to your knowledge,
To our
right?
knowledge, he shared what we had in the email.
He told you what class he was in looking at bullets. He said he was looking at bullets, and he even explained why he was looking at bullets, if you recall.
He said that he and Mom had been at the shooting range over the weekend and he was researching what they had done.
And if you recall, Ms. Fine acknowledged that what Mr. Crumbley's son was doing may not have been appropriate, but there really didn't seem a lot of concern. Would you agree with that?
Well, the concern was that it wasn't appropriate, and that the concern was then expressed by placing a phone call home.
So the concern was the appropriateness of the behavior in class.
Yes.
And at that point, a voicemail was left for Jennifer Crumbley.
Yes.
You said that, if you recall, Mr. Crumbley's son was understanding during the meeting. He didn't fight with you about it. He listened, and eventually he went back to class.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Later in the day, you received an email from the same teacher who expressed that some of Mr. Crumbley's son's prior work may have been a little violent.
No, that was in the same email.
It's in the same email?
It is.
Or was it in an email sent later in the day?
No, it's in the same email from that morning. It was up on the screen. It's at the bottom of it.
The one that was originally sent to Mr. Ejak and Ms. Fine?
Yes.
That was later forwarded to you?
Yes.
You didn't see any of those assignments prior to meeting with Mr. Crumbley's son?
That is correct.
If you had seen those assignments, it probably wouldn't have changed your approach to the meeting, correct? Because the approach was really more about the appropriateness of the behavior. Is that
I
fair?
mean, it's a hypothetical of what we would have done. We acted on the information we had.
And the information that you had was that he was looking at bullets in class.
Yes.
And looking at bullets is not necessarily something that is in itself concerning to you, correct?
I think you're kind of trying to put it in like a pigeonhole. We were trying to gain context of what was going on in the situation. Because a student looking at something on their phone at the end of the hour is different than a student brazenly doing it throughout the entirety of the class. But our conversation was, is this school appropriate or not?
And in fact, if you recall, your position was at the time, it wasn't necessarily concerning because he was honest about it. It seemed kind of a commonplace thing given the Oxford community and the gun culture in the Oxford community and things of that nature that you took into a factor.
We took a lot of things into a factor, including the fact that we conversed of how it was not school appropriate. And that's why a phone call was placed home.
As I just indicated, the Oxford area was and may still be a hunting community if you know.
Okay?
I'm asking.
People hunt who live at Oxford.
In 2021, you would classify it as a hunting community.
I would say that there are people who are hunters, yes.
Activities with guns were a common hobby in 2021, if you know.
I mean, there were people who had guns as a hobby, yes.
It was common for students to be interested in guns
I'm sure there are students who are interested in guns.
and to go to the shooting range.
Yes, students would go to the shooting range.
Yes, I'm just going to object to make sure that the witness is speaking with personal knowledge. It appears counsel is asking him to give general speculation.
Well, if he knows, if you know, you're not familiar with guns yourself, it sounds like. So just if you know.
Okay.
Students going to the shooting range isn't viewed as unusual or concerning in and of itself. Is that correct?
I think that you've got to have context with all of these.
Right, and I'm just asking, in and of itself, a student going to the gun range, the shooting range, is not concerning in and of itself.
It depends on the context. Because the student weightlifting is not concerning in and of itself unless they're doing it inappropriately, right? So you're taking something that's a broad statement that can have a wide context.
And on November 29th of 2021, Mr. Crumbley's son told you and Ms. Fine that he'd gone to the shooting range with his mom the weekend before.
Correct.
That in itself is not concerning to you.
He did it in a way that was appropriate.
You would agree, and And can you refresh my memory? How long were you in the Oxford School District as of 2021?
7 years.
And in that 7 years, you learned that many households had firearms in the household. Would you agree with that, if you know?
What is many? There are people
More
who
than
own
10?
guns. There are people who own guns.
Okay. And you, as a counselor at the school, you were aware of that?
Yes.
It wasn't completely unheard of?
No.
It was also relevant when looking at the situation, it was also relevant for you to note the fact that Mr. Crumbley's son was not hiding that he was looking at the bullets, or didn't hide it from you when he spoke with you and Ms. Fine.
Well, he didn't lie about what had happened.
And that was important to you.
Yes.
As a result of the meeting with Ms. Fine, with you and Ms. Fine, Mr. Crumbley's son was not disciplined.
To my knowledge, no.
There was a phone call placed to his mother, which we've talked about. There was a voicemail left. You did not yourself call Mr. Crumbley.
I did not.
You did not forward him the emails that you received.
I did not.
You don't know if that voicemail was ever shared with Mr. Crumbley. Is that fair?
Well, we talked about it in our meeting the next day.
Okay. On the 29th, you don't know if Mr. Crumbley was ever made aware.
I would have no way of knowing that. No.
Right, you wouldn't know. You responded to the situation of Mr. Crumbley's son looking at bullets on November 29th on his phone with the information that you had.
I did.
And from what you knew at the time, other than the behavior being inappropriate for school, you didn't see anything else that might have been concerning.
Well, and I want to make clear, I wouldn't be the one doing discipline in this situation. So,
And I'm asking, and let me clarify, I'm just asking from a counselor's perspective. I'm not asking for discipline. You clarified that Mr. Eject did discipline and Ms.
okay.
Fine.
So, could you repeat your question, please?
Yes. As a counselor, on November 29th of 2021, you didn't see anything overly concerning about what we've just talked about with looking at bullets on the phone. That the focus was more that looking at bullets on his phone was inappropriate for school.
So, are you asking from a mental health standpoint, did I see anything concerning?
Not really. I don't know that you're a mental health professional. I mean, you're a school counselor and you do have some training and education in that. I'm not asking for you to go anywhere outside of your education and experience. Just as a high school counselor, sitting in Ms. Fine's office with the information that you had, you didn't see a bunch of red flags. We've talked about, and let me give you some, let me go over it a little bit. You've discussed that you know that there are households in Oxford that have firearms in them, right?
Yes, there are.
You know that people in Oxford hunt.
Some do, yes.
You know that students are interested in guns.
Some can be, yes.
You know that students look at bullets.
We had one student who did that in that situation, yes.
You know that student, Mr. Crumbley's son, was honest about looking at the bullets when he was asked about it.
To the extent of our knowledge, yes, he was.
He told you that he'd gone to the shooting range with his mom
Yes.
the weekend before. Yes. Those things were not concerning to you.
Taking those things in a vacuum is why we called home. That's why Ms. Fine called home.
And she said, we had this meeting, we told him it's not appropriate, he understands, no need to call back unless you have questions, right?
I don't remember the exact voicemail that was left.
The voicemail was not, we need you to come to school right now.
To my memory, it was not, but again, I don't remember the exact voicemail that was left.
On November 30th of 2021, you received another email. It's this one, Exhibit 202, which was from another teacher who was talking about Mr. Crumbley's son looking at a video of a guy gunning people down. Correct?
Yes, so this teacher was a co-teacher in that same first hour class.
From the day before?
Yes.
Okay. You reviewed that email on November 30th of 2021.
I did.
You made the decision I think you said you didn't see it for about 20 or 30 minutes.
I didn't. I was on the phone, and I actually responded to it while I was on the phone. And then upon ending that conversation, was going to go meet with the student.
And this is the fourth email that you've received about Mr. Crumbley's son since the beginning of the 2021 school year.
Yes.
The third email in 2 days.
Is it?
You would have received
I think it's the second in 2 days.
the November 29th email about the bullets, and then do you recall receiving a follow-up email later that day?
It was a confirmation of that.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is the second one with additional information.
Okay. The second one on a different issue, is that fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The teacher described the video as a movie scene but not a real event.
Yeah, she said it looks like it's a movie scene and not security footage / a real event.
She expressed some concern based on, quote, some of his other behaviors.
Yeah, but definitely still concerning when taking into account some of his other behaviors, yes.
You did not forward this email to Mr. Crumbley after you received it.
Well, no, but over an hour later I called him into the school.
Right. And you decided after receiving this email that you were going to meet with Mr. Crumbley's son.
Yes.
Approximately an hour after receiving this email, Mr. Ejak advised you of another report made by a teacher about Mr. Crumbley's son.
Yes, as I was about to go and call down his son, Mr. Ejak actually came into my office with information about the math assignment.
And that there were some concerning comments and markings on the math assignment.
I didn't have any context about the math assignment. I just knew there was something about it.
At that point, you hadn't seen it. You were just
I
going
know.
off of what you were being told. Is that fair?
That is fair.
Okay. So you went to Mr. Crumbley's son's classroom.
I did.
You called him out of class.
I walked to his classroom.
Yeah, when I called out, I meant like at his classroom. You went and got him.
Yes.
Okay. While you were there, you also obtained a copy of the worksheet that we've seen.
I did.
And that would have been what I call the modified worksheet. That would be the one that had the things scratched out and the words added that you identified and things like that.
Yes.
Okay. You and Mr. Crumbley's son went back to your office where Nicholas Ejak was waiting in your office, if you recall.
Yes, that is correct.
It was at that point or shortly thereafter that you called Mr. Crumbley's wife.
Approximately 20 minutes into our meeting, yes.
So you met with Mr. Crumbley's son for about 20 minutes.
Yes.
It was during that meeting that Mr. Crumbley's son told you about his family member passing away,
He did?
about his dog passing away,
Yes.
about his friend moving away.
Yes.
Talked about COVID being hard on him.
Yes.
He had a hard time with virtual school, if you remember.
He did say that, yes.
And you asked about the drawings and the markings and the things on the assignment that you had in front of you.
Yes, I asked him to clarify what was going on in the assignment, but I also talked about the email I had received, and I had also talked about in context of the conversation we had yesterday.
Okay. So some of the meeting was about inappropriate behavior. Is that fair?
It started off with a conversation about that because I didn't know what was on the phone, so I asked him what he was watching.
Okay.
And then we talked about, look, we just had a conversation yesterday about appropriate behavior in class. This feels like the same thing that we're dealing with here. And after we had talked about that for a few minutes, I brought the math sheet out and asked him to start explaining to me what was on there.
And when the prosecutor was asking you questions, you said initially when you got that email around 8, well, it would have been 8:30 when you saw the email from the teacher, initially you were frustrated. In fact, you used the word frustrated.
I was frustrated.
And it was kind of like, we just talked about this yesterday. Does that kind of explain what you were feeling at the time?
Yes, I would say that it was, we just had a conversation about this. Why am I hearing about something similar again?
So you talked a little bit about that, and then you talked about the homework, or the math assignment or the math paper that we saw, and you asked for some more context about what was on the paper.
Well, initially I asked him to just describe what was on the paper, and he started talking about how it was a video game, that he liked designing them, liked drawing them. And then I asked for him to explain the words on it, because I didn't feel those were as easily explained by simply stating, well, it's a video game.
And in fact, you said that you didn't want to give context to his words. You didn't want to assume what he meant. You wanted to hear from him what those words meant.
Yes.
And he gave context.
He did. That's when his demeanor changed from kind of being like, what do I have to say to get out of here and to stop getting in trouble, to like he became sad.
And you used the word appropriate to describe his level of sadness based on what he was telling you.
The way he was acting matched what he was saying. It's to me, it's sad if a family dog dies or a family pet dies. It's sad if a relative dies or a friend moves away. So his demeanor matched what he was saying.
And again, in and of itself, being sad is something that you talked about you saw an increase of after COVID in your students. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And
we did.
that was not, again, in and of itself. And I'm not asking you to, I'm not trying to trick you by asking these questions. I'm not trying to give meaning to something that isn't there. I'm asking you, based on the information that you had at the time, you felt that his sadness was an appropriate level of sadness, not overly concerning. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but the sadness itself was not necessarily overly concerning beyond wanting him to talk with someone.
Appropriate and concerning are two different things.
Okay.
When I say appropriate, I mean it matched with what he was saying. Something can be an appropriate response, but also be heavily concerning, right? Like, I don't know a good example off the top of my head, but what I'm saying is his demeanor matched with what he was saying, but to me it was concerning, which is why I called parents.
Right, exactly why you called parents. So if he had been sitting in front of you and talked about these losses and was kind of like, yeah, it's no big deal, it's not a big deal, that could also be concerning.
It would be a different type of concern,
Okay.
yes.
If he said, I lost the top to my pen and was crumbling in pieces and falling into a puddle of tears on your floor, that would be concerning, but for different reasons.
It would be memorable and
Okay.
concerning, yes.
So the losses that he experienced, you agree, I think we can all agree, were significant.
I think when taken in totality, yeah,
And he was showing you that he was sad.
yes.
He was also expressing during this meeting that he had concerns about missing class, if you recall.
He did, especially as after classes changed, which is a normal thing. He expressed that he was worried about missing his chemistry class, which was his next class after the math class. So during that time, Mr. Ejak went and retrieved his belongings and went to go get homework for his chemistry class.
And I'm going to go over that in just a second too, but if you recall, and I don't know if you pay close attention to your students' attendance, but if you recall, Mr. Crumbley's son had pretty good attendance.
He did.
He didn't miss school a lot.
No, he did not.
If you recall, his grades weren't great.
No, but he was on track for graduation. He was passing. I believe he was failing one class at the time, and it was not by much.
So he was close to passing all of his classes. One of them he was failing, but close to passing.
Yes.
So his attendance and his grades obviously were not overly concerning to you.
I wouldn't say overly concerning, but a student who cares about class and wants to, he had expressed an argument the night before and wanted to go to class, had expressed, frustration of missing school during COVID and just that entirety. So it wasn't strange at that point to have a student not want to miss class.
Right. That wasn't odd to you at all, given his history. Now, if he were somebody who missed school all the time and was failing all of his classes, he's like, I really want to be in school, I really want to do my homework, you might feel a little differently. Is that fair?
I would say it was in line based with the information I had.
Okay. And you said that after Mr. Crumbley's son expressed these concerns about missing class, that Mr. Ejak went to his was it first hour class to get the backpack?
It would have been in his second hour class where his belongings were, yes.
So he went, Mr. Ejak went to his second hour class to get his belongings and brought his belongings back to your office.
Yes, this would have been after we had confirmed parents were coming, probably a little after 10 a.m.
He, if you recall, began working on schoolwork, waiting for his parents to get there.
That is my recollection, yes.
Also, if you remember, while you were waiting for his parents, you also began watching some videos with him.
Yep, so he had expressed different things he wanted to do after high school. and he had expressed wanting to go into video game design. I know that when students are waiting for parents, it can be high anxiety time for them. So I wanted to try and engage him as best as I could. So we actually watched videos from the OTEC, the Technical Center campus, where they had programs that were centered around what he wanted to do. So we talked about what it would look like to do an application for them, because he was a sophomore and he would be able to apply for the next school year. And so I did that, one, to kind of just bridge that time that could be high anxiety, and two, if you have any inkling that a student may potentially be displaying any signs of suicide or suicidal ideation, getting a gauge of future plans is crucial. So I wanted to get that gauge as well.
And he did that, and he picked out some videos to watch, is that fair? And you picked some out?
Yeah.
You also asked him during that time if he was a threat to himself or anyone else.
I asked him that earlier.
And that is part of your assessment of the situation, is that fair?
Well, it was a question I felt needed to be asked based on what I had.
And based on your education, your experience, and your training, you know that that's an important question to ask.
In that situation, yes.
And he basically said, I know this looks bad, but I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah, it wasn't said as flippantly, but it was, he understood, like, I can see why this looks bad. I'm not going to do anything.
Okay. So, although you had concerns, you also had the student in front of you reassuring you that he was not going to hurt himself or anyone else.
Based on what he told me, yes.
Mr. Crumbley and his wife arrived at approximately 10:30. I think that there was some time lag between them getting to the school and actually getting into your office of about 10 minutes, if you recall.
Okay, I don't know when they arrived at the school. I know when they arrived to my office.
Their son was in your office when they got there.
Yes.
Mr. Ejak came into the office after Mr. Crumbley and his wife came into your office.
Yes.
Okay. Because at some point he'd left while you were sitting with Mr. Crumbley's son.
He left once we had confirmed that parents were coming.
Mr. Ejak comes back in. When Mr. Crumbley and his wife walk in, I just want to lay the room out a little bit. So there's your desk. You're on one side. On the other side was Mr. Crumbley's son.
Yes.
There was a second chair in front of your desk.
Yes.
Mr. Crumbley sat in the second chair next to his son.
Yes.
And then Mrs. Crumbley sat in a third chair that was available in was it behind Mr. Crumbley a little bit?
So there were two across from my desk, and then there was one that was kind of off on a corner,
Okay.
and that's where she sat.
Your office was not the size of this room, is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair.
Okay. Fairly small?
It's not small. It's a decent-sized office, but it had space where there were two seats across from me, one seat kind of on the kitty corner, a door, and then some space kind of off to what would have been my right as I was sitting in my office.
And Mr. Ejak would have been kind of off to your right, is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, so he wasn't sitting in one of the 3 or 4 chairs with your chair. He was kind of off to the side.
That is correct.
You testified when the prosecutor was asking you questions that while you were talking with Mrs. Crumbley, that you recall Mr. Crumbley was interacting with his son.
I do.
You said that Mr. Crumbley looked at the math assignment, the modified math assignment, because that's the one that you had, that he looked at the modified math assignment with his son.
That is correct.
They looked at it together, and that he showed concern for his son.
Yeah, it felt like he was interacting with his son, and that he mentioned some things that were available for his son.
And we'll talk about that in just a minute. You felt that Mr. Crumbley's interactions with his son, that he was showing the appropriate level of care and caring for him at that point in your office.
Yes, on the surface level, yes. Yes.
You confirmed that Mr. Crumbley's son had gone to the shooting range the weekend before.
I did.
You confirmed that he'd had those losses. He lost a family member, his family dog, and a friend had moved away, that he experienced all those things in the year of 2021.
I also asked, and he had mentioned an argument the night before as well.
And they told you about the argument.
They confirmed that there had been a disagreement, yes.
It's not uncommon for 15-year-olds to argue with their parents. Is that fair?
In a surface level statement, yes, that can happen.
Mrs. Crumbley also confirmed that her son had struggled with virtual school during COVID.
She did.
And that confirms what Mr. Crumbley's son had also told you about not liking virtual school.
Yes.
You told Mr. Crumbley and his wife that, well, let me back up a little bit. You told the prosecutor that your hope was that Mr. Crumbley and his wife would take their son out of school, either get him to see someone to talk to, or to go have a really fun day.
My words to them were I'd like him to get help as soon as possible today if possible.
And so you expressed to them that you wanted him to get help as soon as possible today if possible.
Yes.
And Mrs. Crumbley said, we can't do today, we have to go back to work.
Yes.
They assured you, though, or at least you felt assured, that they were going to get him help.
They were not against it, and they made it seem as if it would be something that they would be willing to do.
Okay. So you handed these 3 sheets of paper to one of them. They didn't toss it in the garbage, right?
Not in front of me, no.
Right. They didn't scoff about it and say, we're not doing this.
They took the paper.
Right. So you had no reason to believe that they weren't going to get their help, either at some point, get their son help, either some point that day or as soon as possible.
Based on the conversation, no, but that's also why I planned the follow-up meeting with the student the next day, was to ensure that there was some movement.
And you planned the follow-up meeting kind of in, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but you kind of planned that in your head, like this is my next step.
Yes.
Okay. You didn't express that during the meeting.
No.
In the meeting, you expressed that you were going to follow up in about 48 hours.
Well, because when Mom said that today wasn't an option, I said 48 hours then, I'll be following up.
Okay. So in your mind, you had some kind of timing that you were going to follow up to make sure that things were being followed through on. Obviously, we know that first check-in point didn't come. But you told them within 48 hours you wanted something done by the next morning. And based on your meeting, you didn't have any reason to think that Mr. Crumbley or his wife were not going to follow up.
I would agree.
Essentially, you wanted to ensure, and I believe that you expressed this to Mr. Crumbley and his wife, wanted to ensure that their son's situation and his sadness didn't get worse.
Right. I wanted to ensure that we had something that, if left unchecked, could get worse.
Right. So sitting in the meeting, you weren't concerned necessarily that that day, or even by the next morning, that their son was going to harm himself.
Based on what he had told me, I did not believe him to be actively harming himself, no.
Or anyone else.
Based on what he had told me, no.
Mr. Crumbley's son expressed that he wanted to stay in school.
He did.
He wanted to stay in school for some of the reasons we've discussed. He didn't like virtual school. He wanted to make sure he could stay up with school. He didn't want to miss class. These are some of the reasons that he gave you.
Yes, those were some of the reasons. He really just said that I struggled with virtual school. I want to make sure I'm staying on top of what I have to do.
And that wasn't concerning to you, that he wanted to stay in school?
No.
Obviously, it's not concerning, right?
In that situation, no. It's not, but given the context of what I was hoping, you take the kid's desires into consideration, but at the end of the day, you want a team making that decision.
And if you recall, you had just had 2 virtual days of school, I think the week before.
Yes, leading up to Thanksgiving, we did have days that were virtual.
And we talked about this a little while ago. To your knowledge, if you recall, and if you don't, just please tell me, he'd only missed 1 day of school that school year.
I know he had good attendance. I don't remember the exact days.
With Mrs. Crumbley expressing that she and Mr. Crumbley had to return to work that day, and Mr. Crumbley's son expressing a desire to stay in school, you felt that it was okay for Mr. Crumbley's son to remain in school.
I felt that I was not given full options at that point because really what I was left trying to decide between was I have parents saying they have to return to work. I have a student that I don't want left alone. And so that's when I asked Mr. Ejak, is there anything from a discipline standpoint? Is there any reason he can't stay in school? Is there anything you need to do? And then I made the decision, I made a judgment call based on what I had, is I didn't want a student potentially home alone.
So based on the information that you had, you decided that it was okay for him to remain in school?
I decided that that was the best decision I thought I could make on the information.
Okay. Based on that meeting, Mr. Crumbley's son, to your knowledge, was not contemplating suicide. You said that he had suicidal ideations, but that's different than being actively suicidal.
It is. The student stated that he was not actively suicidal.
You knew that he had been to the gun range with his mom the weekend prior.
Yes.
You knew at a minimum that he had access to a firearm the weekend before because he went to the gun range.
I knew that he had been to a gun range and had used a firearm at a gun range, yes.
You did not ask him on November 30th of 2021 if he had access to a firearm.
I did not.
You had no reason to look into whether or not he had access to a firearm. Would you agree with that? Based on the information that you had.
It's easy to go in hindsight on a lot of things. Based on what my concerns were, I was concerned about student well-being.
And again, you said it's easy to go in hindsight. So we know what happened within a couple hours of this meeting.
Sure.
We all in this courtroom know what happened. It's easy for us to look back and say that different decisions could have been made, right?
I made the decisions I made based on the information I had
At the time.
at the time.
You don't have the benefit of hindsight at 10:40 or 10:50 a.m. on November 30th of 2021. Is that fair?
I had 90 minutes of information.
You suggested that his parents find a therapist for him to talk to or evaluate him.
I did.
You have had experience with parents who have refused to provide mental health treatment to their child. Is that accurate? Do you recall that?
Off the top of my head, I'm not recalling a specific instance of that.
If it occurred, do you remember testifying previously about that?
I don't know.
Okay. Would reviewing your testimony on that help to refresh your recollection?
If we want to bring it up, sure.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Sure.
Thank you.
If you would like to read the highlighted portions, Mr. Hopkins, thank you.
You can just read that to yourself and let us know if it refreshes your recollection, all right?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yeah, so I had asked, like, if it's occurred, and I say it's not overly common, but I'm sure it does happen. But I'm giving a for instance of what we would do in that type of situation if it were to happen.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Sure.
Thank you. So reviewing, based on what you just said, reviewing the transcript has helped to refresh your recollection.
Well, what I'm stating in the transcript is in a situation where that could happen, that what we would do is involve CPS and make sure that the student is receiving ordinary care.
In fact, the question was,
You told the jury what CPS is.
Child Protective Services would be involved if that situation were to occur.
in fact, the question was, thank you, okay. Had you ever dealt with a kid at school who you felt needed psychiatric care and yet the parents didn't provide it in some fashion or another? Your answer was yes, that had occurred.
And then I go on to explain what would happen in that type of situation.
Right. You said it's not overly common. It does happen. If it did happen, this is what we would do. Correct?
Correct.
And I know I've asked this a couple of times, but you didn't have any reason to believe on November 30th of 2021 that James Crumbley or his wife were not going to follow through and obtain a therapist for their child to talk to.
I didn't have enough time to know if that would happen or not. Given our context of our conversation, no, I didn't have reason to believe that at that time.
If you recall, the meeting with Mr. Crumbley and his wife and their son concluded at approximately 10:50 in the morning.
That sounds about right, yes.
Their son left the room first, if you recall, and went back to class.
Yes.
The shooting began at approximately 12:51 p.m. that day.
Okay.
After you heard that there was a shooter at the school, you did not immediately suspect that it was Mr. Crumbley's son, if you remember.
I did not.
In fact, you didn't suspect that it was Mr. Crumbley's son until you looked into his attendance after the shooting.
Correct.
This is also after Mr. Crumbley's son had already been arrested.
Quite a bit after, yes.
I'm going to talk about just a few things. Just go back to your direct testimony with the prosecutor. You said that calling a parent in is a high level of concern.
Yes.
And that could be a concern for appropriate behavior.
It could be, yes.
It could be a concern for the student's well-being.
It could be.
It could be a concern that the student needs immediate care or help.
Yes.
It could be for any number of reasons. A high level of concern is dependent on the situation. Is that fair?
Yes, I would agree.
You're concerned with going to Mr. Crumbley's son's class on November 30th of 2021 is you specifically mentioned that you went because it doesn't basically raise concern or red flags if a counselor goes down to get a student out of class.
Yes, that is true. And I had very little information at that point as to what was going on. So I wanted to make sure to do it. And I knew that the dean wanted me involved in a conversation. So I knew that student support was at least a potential plan at that point.
When you were discussing, you said that you told Mr. Crumbley's son while you were meeting with him before his parents got there that you wanted his parents to get him help. Do you remember discussing that with the prosecution?
I do.
Okay. At that time, Mr. Crumbley's son didn't say, "Thank goodness, I've been begging my parents for help and they haven't given it to me."
I'm not sure many students would.
He didn't say, "I'm glad you're going to ask them because I've asked them and they didn't listen."
He did not say that, no.
He didn't say, I really need this and I'm really glad that you're doing this for me."
He did not.
He didn't say any of that.
No, which also would not be, it's not uncommon for students to not have a big response to something like that.
If he had said any of those things, obviously your reaction would be different when Mr. Crumbley and his wife got to the school.
It would be different information that I did not have, yes.
And when Mr. Crumbley and his wife were at the school, they also didn't say anything about, or Mr. Crumbley didn't say anything specifically about, wow, son, you really did need some help. You've been asking me for it, right?
No.
The discussion was simply looking at the math assignment, the modified math assignment, and then Mr. Crumbley expressing to his son, you know you have people to talk to, right?
That was a piece of it over the 10 minutes, yes.
That they've talked. Mr. Crumbley and his son have spoken.
Yep, he did say that they talked.
When discussing the impact of Mr. Crumbley's son's friend leaving, you don't know that Mr. Crumbley's son had ever expressed how significant that impact was on him. Is that fair? Until sitting in your office.
I had very little context, even when he was in my office, over what that was. All I knew is that a friend had left recently, had moved, and that was hard.
You indicated on your direct testimony with Mr. Keese that Mr. Crumbley mentioned you have people you can talk to, we talk, and then mentioned something, your testimony was that his son mentioned something about a journal, or I'm sorry, that Mr. Crumbley mentioned something about a journal.
Mr. Crumbley's statement to my recollection was, you have your counselor, you have your journal, we talk.
Okay. Mr. Crumbley didn't say, your journal, you know, the one that's in your backpack.
No.
He didn't say the one that you always keep with you.
No.
He didn't say a color.
No.
He didn't describe it at all.
No.
So to your knowledge, based on that conversation, you can't say that Mr. Crumbley's son knew what his son's journal would look like if he had a journal, based on that conversation.
No, I had no knowledge beyond that there was an existence of some sort of journal.
One moment, Your Honor.
Sure.
Mr. Hopkins, you made decisions on November 30th of 2021 based on your education, your training, and your experience, correct?
That was a piece of it.
Also based on the information that you had in front of you,
That was a majority of it.
which included 4 emails from teachers in approximately 2 months regarding Mr. Crumbley's son,
That was a part of it, yes.
concerns that those teachers had raised,
Yes, that was a part of it.
much of which you did not share with Mr. Crumbley prior to that November 30th meeting. Is that fair?
Correct. It was shared during the meeting.
Based on all of these things, you did not believe that Mr. Crumbley's son was an immediate danger to himself,
I did not believe that, no.
nor did you believe that he was a danger to anyone else.
Based on the information I had, no.
I have no further questions.
Read that.
Thank you. Mr. Hopkins, it appears that information and context would be important to you in these kinds of meetings.
Yes, it was.
Okay. Now, did James Crumbley tell you that November 30th wasn't the first time that his son asked for help?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that his son asked for help in April of 2021?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that, despite that, never once was an appointment with a medical health provider set up?
No.
Did James Crumbley ever tell you that as early as June of 2021, his son had obtained his own firearm?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that his son had been begging for a 9mm firearm?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that his son actually sent him a screenshot of a 9mm for sale a few weeks before the meeting?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that his son actually obtained a 9mm just 4 days before this meeting?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that the 9mm he obtained looked identical to the 9mm that he drew right here on this picture?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that he worked for DoorDash, he hadn't begun work that day, and he could have taken his son home?
No.
Did he tell you that when his son was talking about his friend leaving, it was actually his only friend?
No.
So you took what you learned from the defendant's son, you described those losses he felt as significant,
I did.
and that's without knowing all that information?
Yes.
You mentioned that you would hope that a decision about a student would be made by a team.
I did.
Who's on the team?
The student, the parents, and any caring adult at the school.
And did either James or Jennifer Crumbley share any information with you?
They did not.
Had they of, what would you have done?
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
She asked the same question on cross.
Did you ask that question?
She asked, what would you have done? Talking about calling CPS and such.
No, actually, that was related to if they had,
She asked if they had not obtained treatment for their son
yes,
by the following day or within 48 hours.
if they had refused, actually, if they had refused to obtain mental health treatment, what would he have done? Not,
I'll rephrase, Judge, that's fine. Mr. Hopkins, you testified earlier that your plan was to call Child Protective Services within 48 hours?
Yes,
And that's based upon just the information that you learned from the defendant's son?
it is.
Would this meeting have ended differently had you known all the other information that we just went through?
objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
I think it does call for speculation.
I believe he can offer a definitive answer here, Judge.
A definitive answer about what would have happened if they had not contacted a therapist. Is that what you mean?
No, Your Honor. He's asking about a definitive answer for what Mr. Hopkins would have done if there had been additional information. And Your Honor, can we approach, can we approach, please?
Okay, can you turn off the audio? possibly.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. You were asked on cross-examination that you didn't ask the shooter on November 30th if he had access to a gun. Do you remember that?
I do.
And your response was what?
I did not.
Okay, and did you have reason to ask him about that?
At that time, I didn't feel I did.
And you were asked about the shooter's recitation of what happened at the shooting range with his mother.
Are you stating I asked that?
No, you were asked that.
Oh, by cross.
Okay, so you learned on November the 29th and November the 30th that the defendant's son went to a shooting range with his mother that prior weekend.
I did.
Did James Crumbley tell you that the shooter actually shot his new gun?
No.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
You can step down and you're excused. You guys need a break.
Thank you, Judge.
All right, so about 10 minute break.
All rise for the jury.
All right, you may be seated. What's the next one?
I'm going to find out right now, Judge. We have somebody traveling in, so I want to make sure it's here.
All right, so about 10 minutes.
That'd be fine, Judge.
Thank you.
If you can all just remain seated, please.
All right, while the trial is on a short recess, we're going to take a break. So I'm going to put up the standby or live stream will resume shortly screen, and we'll be back live when court resumes.
All right.
There's obviously 10 after, a lot of 10 after 10.
Your Honor, calling People First James Crumbley, case number 222799989FH.
Thank you, Marquise, on behalf of people.
Karen McDonald on behalf of the people.
Good morning, Your Honor. Mario Lehman on behalf of Mr. Crumbley, who is standing to my left.
Ready for the jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Judge.
Who's the next witness?
Mr. Nick Ejak.
This one doesn't go on alphabetically.
All rise for the jury.
Yeah, is there a button right there? This one doesn't go on automatically, the other ones. Is there a button on the back?
Yes.
It's, yeah. You may be seated. Who's the next witness?
Nick Ejak.
Good morning. Could you raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm the testimony about to give is the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay, could you step up and have a seat? And then could you state your name for the record and spell your first and last name?
Sure. Nicholas Ejak, first name Nicholas, last name Ejak, Ejak.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
In the year of 2021, where did you work?
Oxford High School.
Okay. And what role did you work there?
I was the Dean of Students.
Could you keep your voice nice and loud?
Sure. I was the Dean of Students.
Okay. And tell us, please, what does the Dean of Students do?
So the Dean of Students is primarily responsible for student code of conduct, so behavior and discipline, overseeing the attendance of the school, academic intervention, behavior intervention.
Okay. So Mr. Hopkins just testified, and he indicated he was a counselor, whereas you are the Dean of Students. So it would be fair to say that you handled discipline, whereas he handled the student advocacy?
Yes.
Okay. As of November of 2021, how long have you been in that role?
Just about 4 months.
Okay, so you were hired for that school year in the fall of 2021.
Correct.
Now that's part of administration, is that correct?
It's an extension of it, yes.
Okay. Was James Crumbley's son a student at Oxford High School in November of 2021?
Yes.
Prior to November of 2021, did you have any interaction with James Crumbley's son?
I did not know.
I want to direct your attention to what's been admitted as People's 201. This is an email from November the 29th, 2021, 9:32 a.m. And the email reads, "Good morning. I had a student during first hour, the defendant's son, who was on his phone looking at different bullets at the end of first hour today as I was walking around the room passing out their essays. I didn't get a chance to investigate it a bit further since it was the end of the hour. Now that he's on my radar, I'm also noticing that some of his previous work that he's completed from earlier in the year leans a bit toward the violent side. I can bring down these things later today during my 5th hour prep if you would like them." So you and Miss Pamela Fine were both on that email?
That is correct.
Okay, and tell us, please, who's Pamela Fine?
So Ms. Fine is the restorative practices coordinator and the anti-bullying coordinator for the school district.
Okay. And tell us a little bit, if you know, what that role entails.
Sure. So restorative care in anti-bullying across the district. She would be working with students to restore situations between two different students, a student and a teacher. It deals a lot with behavior, and so it's more of like, how do you fix or repair the situation? And so she often would collaborate with me on student discipline, and then the anti-bullying programming for the district would be like mentoring kids together to prevent bullying and to report it, when they see it, and it's more of a proactive approach.
Okay. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you, Ms. Fine, and Mr. Hopkins have separate roles, but sometimes they intersect.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Now, did you have any interaction with the defendant's son on November the 29th of 2021?
I did not know.
Okay, and tell me what happened after this email was received by you.
So it was received by me when I was in a meeting that morning. So I wasn't made aware of it until after there was a meeting that took place between Ms. Fine, Mr. Hopkins, and the defendant's son.
Okay, so by the time that you had read this email, that situation had already been addressed by Ms. Fine and Mr. Hopkins?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you have any follow-up emails, conversations, or any other interaction regarding the defendant's son or with the defendant's son on Monday, November the 29th?
I did not know.
I'm going to direct your attention now to Tuesday, November the 30th, 2021. This is People's Exhibit 203. This is from a teacher in the school. Email sent Tuesday, November 30th, 2021, 9:32 a.m. It's addressed to you and Mr. Hopkins. Reads, "Here's the photo I took of this paper in case you need it. Signed, Becky." And there's an attachment. Did you receive this email?
Yes, I did.
Okay, tell us about your interactions with either students or administrators prior to receiving this email with regards to the defendant's son.
So I had received this email after I had alerted Mr. Hopkins to the worksheet because this teacher brought a photo of that to
Okay,
my
let me back up just a
Sure.
little bit. So before this email was received by you, did you have a conversation with a teacher regarding the defendant's son?
No, I did not.
Okay, so tell me how it is that you became aware of this math worksheet.
So the morning of November 30th, 2021, I was in my office when Miss Morgan, who is the teacher that sent this email, came down to our front office looking for anybody that she could speak with about a student that had drawn some inappropriate things on a worksheet.
And you were there?
I was the only one available at the time, yes.
Okay, and tell me about that interaction, please.
So she entered the threshold of my office door and said she was just looking for somebody to report something, and so I had waved her into my office, and she had stated that there was a student that had drawn some inappropriate things on a worksheet, and then she proceeded to turn her phone around and show me a photo of the said worksheet.
Okay, so this is Exhibit 130. Do you recognize this?
I do, yes.
And how do you recognize it?
That's the photo that was on her phone.
Okay. And so she turned her phone around and shows you this?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
And tell me what happened next, please.
So I briefly read the statements and looked for a name in the corner and noticed that it was a name of the student that had been in the meeting with Mr. Hopkins and Ms. Fine from the day before.
Okay, so you looked at the worksheet. What stood out to you when you first saw it?
The phrases that were written on there.
Specifically, which ones?
The thoughts won't stop. Help me. The world is dead.
Okay. What happened next?
My response to her was, I need to get his counselor. And her response to me was she needed to return to class.
Okay. So she went back to class?
Yes.
And then what did you do?
I walked down to the counseling portion of our front office to alert Mr. Hopkins.
Okay. And tell us about the interaction you had with Mr. Hopkins.
Sure. So when I arrived to his office, before I even mentioned anything, he brought up the defendant's son in sort of a question form, and my response to him was, yes, how did you know? And then he proceeded to share with me that he had received an email that morning regarding that student and thought that that's why I was there at his office. And then I had shared with him that I had just been shown a photo from Miss Morgan
Okay.
And kind of explained what I had saw on the worksheet. And he immediately stood up from his desk and said, I'll go retrieve him from class.
Okay, so he received a different email the morning of November 30th than the picture
Yes.
that you were shown?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you saw this picture, were you considering this in the realm of student discipline?
Not at all, no.
Okay,
I
so
was more concerned that there was a mental health concern.
Is
And
that
so-
why you decided to get his counselor involved?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So after you shared what you learned with Mr. Hopkins, he went and retrieved the student back to his office?
Yes.
Okay, and tell us what happened next, please.
So I waited in Mr. Hopkins' office for him to return with the student, and he came in and sat down and began to kind of talk through what was going on that led him to write those things on his worksheet and draw some characters on there. And the defendant's son repeatedly made sure that we were aware that he understood why we needed to do this and that it made sense and that he understood how bad it looked.
Okay. Did you lead that interaction with the defendant's son, or did Mr. Hopkins?
Mr. Hopkins did.
And why is that?
As the school counselor, therefore, looking into a potential mental health concern, that would be his responsibility.
Okay. Did your perspective, based upon the information that you were told, ever change from a mental health lens versus a discipline lens?
It did not, no.
So tell us what happened next after the defendant's son went through the drawing with Mr. Hopkins?
So he had sort of explained that he was interested in video games and that part of those the drawings on there were him trying to get into graphic design, which led into a little bit of a conversation about how there could be potential avenues during his time at Oxford High School to delve into that deeper with some other programs. And then he kind of leaned in more towards the statements that were written on there and talked about how those didn't necessarily explain the video game aspect. And then I listened to the defendant's son speak about him feeling sad lately,
Okay.
which in a high school is not that unusual.
Were you involved in the decision to contact the parents of the student?
I was there for it, but Mr. Hopkins had mentioned that we were going to reach out to his parents.
Okay. At some point, did you leave Mr. Hopkins' office?
Yes, that was after we were able to speak with a parent on the phone, and so I left to retrieve the students' belongings since our class periods had changed.
Okay. At that point in time, COVID protocols were still in place?
Yes,
Okay. Did students carry their backpacks with them?
yes,
So you retrieved the defendant's son's backpack from the class that he was in and brought it to Mr. Hopkins' office?
that is correct, yes.
Okay. And did the defendant's son stay with Mr. Hopkins until his parents arrived?
Yes.
All right. Were you there in Mr. Hopkins' office the entire time, or did you come back in?
No, I came back in once the parents had arrived for the meeting.
Now, what was your expectation of what was to happen that day after the meeting with the parents?
My understanding and expectation was that, based on the recommendation from the counselor, that the student would be leaving that day, based on prior experiences at schools where parents are called in to talk about student mental health. Typically, they leave when it's suggested that they leave.
With the student?
Yes.
You were there for the, how long, first of all, how long did the entire meeting last between James and Jennifer Crumbley and Mr. Hopkins and yourself?
I was there for 10 minutes of it, and there had been maybe 3 or 4 minutes prior to my arrival.
Okay.
I'm not sure if they waited for me to start or if they had already begun, but I know that I arrived a few minutes after they did, after I was alerted that they had arrived.
So were you there when Mr. Hopkins explained his concerns about the drawing?
Yes.
Okay. Now, he just testified, so I don't need you to go through everything he said, but do you recall if James Crumbley said anything?
During the meeting?
Yes.
He did. He expressed concern for his son, that he knew, or he reminded his son that he could always speak to him about stuff, and that he had a journal that he could write stuff in if he was feeling frustrated or going through something.
Now, as a dean of students, when are you permitted to search a student's personal belongings?
So when I have a reasonable suspicion that the student might have something illegal or something that's not allowed at school, and so there needs to be some sort of sign, like a report from somebody. Oftentimes kids will be seen with it, or they'll be showing whatever the things are that they've brought to school they're not supposed to. There needs to be some type of a suspicion or alert that I have that will allow me to do that. And so in this situation, there wasn't something that alerted me that indicated I needed to search.
Okay, and why not?
Nothing that he said, nothing that he, none of the behavior that he exhibited when I returned with his bag indicated that. There wasn't any suspicion that I had at the time that allowed me to believe that I needed to do that.
At any point were you informed about the defendant's son's access to weapons?
I was not, no.
Okay. Were you given details by either James or Jennifer Crumbley about the words and drawings on this exhibit?
I was not, no.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Prior to becoming the Dean of Students at Oxford High School, you worked in various schools and school districts. Is that correct?
Yes.
For most of your career, in fact, you worked with at-risk students.
Yes.
Normally, that includes students with some sort of academic or behavioral problems.
Yes, that is correct.
In fact, your role at Oxford High School, you testified today, primarily you dealt with the code of conduct,
Yes.
Behavioral and academic intervention,
Yes.
and issues with attendance.
Yes.
You had not had contact with Mr. Crumbley's son until November 30th of 2021.
That's correct.
So, as far as you know, once you became employed by Oxford High School, there were no behavioral issues with Mr. Crumbley's son?
There was not.
No academic issues? No attendance issues?
No.
You learned on November 29th of 2021 that Mr. Crumbley's son was looking at bullets on his phone in class.
Yes, that is correct.
But once you had been made aware of it, or once you learned of it, you learned that that had already been handled by Mr. Hopkins and Ms. Fine. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So you didn't do anything else with anything that day?
No.
Okay.
I didn't need to do anything further based on the fact that Ms. Fine and Mr. Hopkins did everything that I would have done in that situation.
Okay. So you didn't see any need for additional discipline or any additional intervention or anything like that, correct?
That's correct.
On November 30th of 2021, you were advised by one of Mr. Crumbley's son's teachers that he was writing inappropriate statements on his on a math assignment.
Yes.
You were quickly shown a picture of the assignment on a cell phone, if you recall.
Yes, that is
You
correct.
didn't look at it very well, correct?
No.
You saw that there were drawings,
Yes.
but you didn't see necessarily what all the drawings were. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
You did see the words blood everywhere,
Yes,
but you didn't see much beyond that.
that's correct.
To you, the words on the page were more concerning than the drawings themselves, right?
I would agree with that, yes.
And that's because sometimes kids in high school draw violent things.
Absolutely, yes.
That's not abnormal.
It's not abnormal.
You felt that what was on the paper was not appropriate for school, is that correct?
Yep, I would agree with that.
But that it wasn't in and of itself concerning,
Yes,
and that you didn't see it as a threat to anybody.
that is correct.
You didn't see a correlation of violence with the drawings on the paper?
I did not know.
Again, Mr. Crumbley's son had no prior disciplinary history,
He did not know.
no prior bad behavior.
He did not.
He was a pretty average student.
He was, yes.
He'd only missed one class that year.
I can't speak to that.
You said you dealt with attendance, so that's why I was asking.
Yes, sure.
So you're not aware of his attendance
I'm not
history?
aware of specifically his attendance.
Okay. He had none of the typical early indicators that there would be an issue of concern other than these isolated incidents from November 29th and November 30th that you were aware of.
Judge, I'm just going to object to the form of the question. Typical indicators. This witness can testify regarding code of conduct and discipline, but that's it.
Yeah, unless he is able to testify about what a typical indicator would be by his experience.
And I can ask him that, Your Honor. Based on your experience dealing and your education and training with at-risk students and for your position as the Dean of Students, there are what you would consider early indicators of potentially concerning or threatening behavior. Is that fair?
I would say that's a fair statement.
Some of those include prior disciplinary history.
Yes.
prior bad behavior by the student,
Yes.
issues with grades,
Yes.
issues with attendance.
Yes.
Okay. So, knowing all of that, none of those, what I'm calling early indicators, were present other than the 2 incidents that you were aware of on November 29th and November 30th of 2021.
As far as I was aware, yes.
You sat in on the conversation between Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Crumbley's son on November 30th of 2021.
Yes, I did.
And that was before his Mr. Crumbley and his wife got to the school.
That's correct.
Based on the information that you had at that time, you did not believe that Mr. Crumbley's son posed a threat to anyone.
That's a fair statement, yes.
You were even less concerned after you confirmed some of the information that you'd learned from Mr. Crumbley's son with Mr. Crumbley's wife.
Yes, after she had confirmed all the information he shared with us, my concern from a discipline standpoint was pretty much lowered all the way to none at that point.
Okay. And you said all of the information that he had shared with you. And we've heard some about that, but I just want to confirm. That was about the losses that he'd experienced in 2021, correct? The loss of a family member?
Yes.
The loss of his family dog?
Yes.
A friend had moved away?
Yes.
He'd struggled with COVID?
He did, yes.
He had a hard time with virtual school?
Yes.
Those were the things that you confirmed with his family, with his parents?
Along with his desire for graphic design and video games, and that they thought he should focus more on academics rather than that, which is what he had shared with us during the meeting.
Okay. When you say he had shared with us, are you referencing a discussion or an argument he had with his parents the night before that related to video game design and grades, or was this something separate?
Both. No, he had shared that he was interested in that and that he didn't feel his parents supported that, and that led to an argument the night before, but he didn't provide any context to that at all, and they had confirmed that, but they also didn't provide any context to that either.
So there was a confirmation that the student and Mr. Crumbley's son and Mr. Crumbley and his wife had an argument with their son the night before. It sounded to you like it may have related to video game design and grades, but you didn't have any context beyond what you believed it to be about.
That's correct, yes.
Now, obviously, during these meetings, you expect for a student's parents to give you information about things that they are concerned about, correct?
Typically in these meetings, parents come to them and they provide additional context, stuff they're seeing at home, a history of, especially in a mental health situation, a history of any kind of counseling, and any issues they've had at other schools or whatever, but they usually provide additional information.
So you said specifically things that they see at home, things that they're concerned about. Obviously, in order for a parent to see something at home or be concerned about it, they have to be aware of it. Is that fair?
Speculation too, Jen.
I don't know how a parent could be concerned if they're not aware of something.
The Dean of Students can't testify as to how a parent would be aware of something at home in a meeting, not even specific to what we're talking about here.
Actually, my question was different, Your Honor. My question was, he would expect that, or it's his belief that if a parent is concerned about something, then they're aware of it.
But then it's a lack of personal knowledge. Mr. Ejak was the Dean of Students in Oxford High School in November of 2021, in charge of discipline and code of conduct issues, Judge. Mr. Hopkins was the counselor. He's already testified.
Okay. I think are you asking him if the parents aren't aware of something, they're not aware of it?
Kind of, Your Honor. Obviously, and I can ask my question differently and see if it makes it a little more simple.
All right.
Mr. Ejak, based on your experience, your education and your training, and just your knowledge in general of you're a human being, if someone doesn't have knowledge of something, they can't talk about it. Is that fair? Does that make sense to you?
I would say that's a fair statement.
So we can't talk about things we don't know about. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Obviously, James Crumbley can't tell you about things he may not be aware of.
Yes.
You weren't concerned on November 30th of 2021 by Mr. Crumbley's son looking at bullets or drawing guns. Is that fair?
I think there was a level of concern there, which is why we called the parents in for the meeting.
And if you recall, the level of concern was regarding the appropriateness of behavior in school.
Yes.
You didn't find his interest in guns or bullets concerning, especially in the Oxford community, if you remember.
Yes, that's correct.
You've had students draw guns on papers in the past.
Yes, that's correct.
In fact, students in Oxford, not all of them, I'm not saying all students in Oxford, but there are students in Oxford who have guns in their home.
Yes.
You know that there are students in Oxford who handle firearms.
That's a fair statement.
You would agree that it's not unusual
No, it's not unusual.
in that community.
In that community, yes.
I'm not asking you to speak about any other community, but in that community, it's not unusual for students to handle guns.
That's correct.
When faced with a situation where a student has drawn guns on papers, you typically use your education and training to assess the risk.
As far as a discipline standpoint,
Discipline or otherwise, whatever your role is in that assessment.
yes, so my role would be to look for any violation of our code of conduct. And so that by itself, the drawings on the worksheet, don't violate a code of conduct.
And a violation of the code of conduct would also encompass any sort of a threat to other people. Is that fair?
That's a fair statement.
So as part of your assessment, you're also determining whether or not there's a threat.
I'm determining whether or not I need to alert somebody to something that could potentially be a threat.
And in this situation, you didn't make that alert. Is that fair?
That is correct. There wasn't any information that led me to believe there would be a reason to alert somebody else.
And part of your assessment is, again, looking at those typical early indicators that we talked about, whether there's a history of violence, correct?
That's correct.
A history of discipline,
That is correct.
bullying behavior.
That is correct.
You look at, to see if there's a direct threat.
That is correct.
If those things are not apparent, if those things are not present, then it's just a student who drew a gun. Is that accurate?
That's pretty accurate, yes.
You were part of the meeting after Mr. Crumbley and his wife arrived. And let me go back a little bit. So you sat in on the meeting between Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Crumbley's son, correct?
That is correct.
If you know, that meeting occurred, lasted approximately 90 minutes?
I don't remember.
Okay. You left that meeting at some point.
Yes.
Then you came back once Mr. Crumbley and his wife arrived.
So I left the meeting to retrieve his belongings, the students' belongings, and returned back to the office and then left again until the parents arrived.
Okay. You entered Mr. Hopkins' office after Mr. Crumbley and his wife arrived in Mr. Hopkins' office.
That's correct.
You saw that Mr. Crumbley was seated next to his son,
Yes.
which
that's
was directly across the desk from Mr. Hopkins.
Yes.
It was your perception that Mr. Crumbley was showing care for his son,
Yes.
that he reassured his son that he can always talk to him.
Yes.
You mentioned something on direct with the prosecution about a journal,
Yes, I did.
and you seem to recall that Mr. Crumbley made reference to a journal.
He did, yes.
You don't recall Mr. Crumbley saying the one that you always keep with you?
I don't recall that, no.
He didn't say anything like the one that's in your backpack,
I don't recall.
specific colors,
I don't remember.
how long he's had it.
I don't remember.
There were no specifics about anything about a potential journal.
Not that I can recall.
So to your knowledge, you don't know if there was one journal or 15 journals. Is that fair?
I can't speak to that, no.
Right, you have no knowledge of that. Is that fair?
Yes.
After meeting with Mr. Crumbley and his wife, you felt that they were receptive of getting their son help, as was suggested by Mr. Hopkins.
Yes.
You and Sean Hopkins did not insist that it be done that day. Now, I'm going to clarify because I know that Mr. Hopkins indicated that he preferred that it would be done that day, but neither of you said, you need to take him today and you need to go get him help right now, and if you don't, there's going to be a problem.
What Mr. Hopkins had stated was that they needed to find him some counseling as soon as possible that day, if possible.
And that he was going
he would be following up within 48 hours to ensure there was something secured for the student.
And that was going to be my next question, that he was going to follow up in a couple of days, 48 hours.
Yes.
And in fact, you didn't feel in that meeting that Mr. Crumbley's son was in need of immediate care based on your education and training and perception and knowledge that you had in that meeting.
I can't speak to that.
In no way did you feel that Mr. Crumbley was being neglectful of his son.
No, I did not.
You felt that Mr. Crumbley showed the appropriate level of emotion with his son in that meeting.
Objection is, he can't speculate as the appropriate level of emotion. He's the Dean of Students regarding Code of Conduct, November of 21. Speculation.
Was there anything odd about his interaction with his son?
I wouldn't say there was anything odd.
Okay.
You also didn't find it strange that Mr. Crumbley and his wife did not take their son home that day, because there was no reason for him to go home that day. Is that correct?
As far as the discipline goes, no.
During the meeting, you said that you retrieved Mr. Crumbley's son's backpack from his classroom and brought it back to Mr. Hopkins' office.
That's correct.
You indicated this backpack was heavy.
Yes, such as every other student in the school.
And let me clarify, that day, you didn't say that today. That day, November 30th of 2021, you commented to a teacher that the backpack was heavy.
Yes, I made a joke at how easily she picked it up, and then when she handed it off to me, my arm dropped down. So it was more of a joke at how strong she was compared to myself.
And if you recall, at the time, the students weren't using their lockers,
They were not using their
so it was
lockers.
fairly common for a student's backpack to be heavy.
That's correct.
You didn't look in the backpack?
I did not know.
You didn't, and I think you said you didn't have reason to look in the
I
backpack.
didn't have reasonable suspicion, no.
You didn't ask Mr. Crumbley's son to look in his backpack?
I did not know.
You did not ask Mr. Crumbley or his wife to look in the backpack?
I did not know.
You didn't look yourself or ask anyone else to look because you didn't feel that there was a reason to look in the backpack. Is that fair?
There was nothing from our conversation or from anything that we had heard so far that would indicate it was enough to reach to that level, correct?
You've had numerous discussions about this case since November 30th of 2021.
Yes.
You've talked with various attorneys,
Sure. Yeah.
and I'm not asking you about what your communications were with your own attorneys. I'm not asking about that. I'm just asking if you've met with attorneys.
I've met with many different attorneys.
You've met with the prosecutor's office
Yes.
on more than one occasion.
Yes.
And some of those meetings with the prosecutor's office were to prepare for testimony.
Yes.
Some were to get more information about what occurred on November 30th of 2021.
One was yes.
You learned through some of those meetings that there was no indication that there was a handgun in Mr. Crumbley's son's backpack.
Can you restate that?
Sure. You learned through some of the meetings with the prosecutor's office that there was no indication that there was a handgun in Mr. Crumbley's son's backpack while he was in Mr. Hopkins' office.
Object to the form of the question.
Yeah, what do you mean? What do you mean? Can you restate that?
Yes. I will be more clear. Do you recall testifying in September
What are you
of...
referring to, counsel?
There was testimony in September 14th of 2022 that relates to this. If you'd like, we can approach to talk about it further.
I think we should.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Lindley.
Thank you, Your Honor. As you know, approximately 2 hours after the meeting, after this meeting with Mr. Hopkins, yourself, and Mr. Crumbley and his wife, Mr. Crumbley's son began the shooting.
Yes.
You saw the footage of the shooting.
I did, yes.
You were not aware that Mr. Crumbley's son was the shooter.
Initially.
At the time.
When I saw all of the footage?
No, let me go back. So at some point early on the day of the shooting, you saw footage of the shooting.
Yes.
And that was while you were in the office of the school.
On the phone with the 911 operator?
Yes. And at that point, the thought didn't cross your mind that the shooter may be Mr. Crumbley's son.
That's a fair statement, yes.
In fact, you didn't know that it was Mr. Crumbley's son until you were told that it was him after the shooting.
I believe as the video footage continued to play and we were still on the phone. It wasn't confirmed, but I had a pretty good idea that that's who it was.
Okay. Even looking back, after you know what Mr. Crumbley's son did 2 hours after that meeting, his behaviors did not show a pattern of what he was planning to do 2 hours later.
Based on the information I knew, no.
It's fair to say that you have years of experience with at-risk students.
Yes, that's correct.
Years of experience with behavioral, academic, attendance, issues of that nature.
Yes.
You have education and training about concerning things to look for in students.
Yes.
You knew that Mr. Crumbley's son was looking at bullets on his phone on November 29th of 2021.
Yes.
You knew that he had drawn a gun and some concerning words on his math assignment.
Yeah, that's correct.
You knew that he was at the shooting range with his mom the weekend before.
Yes, that's correct.
You confirmed that during the meeting with his parents, correct?
Yes.
You knew that he had experienced significant losses in the months before November 30th of 2021.
Yes.
You knew that Mr. Hopkins was recommending that his parents have him talk to a therapist that day if possible.
That's correct.
You knew that his backpack was heavy and commented about the weight of it to a teacher.
That's correct.
You knew that firearms were not uncommon in homes in Oxford.
That's correct.
You knew that students at the high school handled firearms and that it wasn't uncommon.
We're asked and answered numbers.
You knew,
Yeah, he answered that.
you knew that the shooter was going to stay in school that day.
At the end of the meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
Partly because he wanted to,
Yes.
and partly because his parents had to go to work.
That's what I was told, yes.
And with all of this, all of the knowledge that you had on November 30th of 2021 at approximately 10:52 a.m., you did not feel that he was a threat to anyone, and you didn't feel that you had reasonable suspicion to look at his backpack.
No, because you have to remember, I knew very little of what we all know today. So when we're looking at the big picture today, I knew a fraction of what we all know now.
And we talked about this a little bit with Mr. Hopkins as well. We all know what happened at 12:51 on November 30th of 2021. But the information that you have at 10:52 a.m. or approximately 10:50 a.m. when that meeting ended, is the information that you were going on.
Yes, and that does not rise to the level of suspension or of a discipline, especially when you're considering mental health.
And it doesn't.
That supersedes any type of minor discipline or behavior violation.
So, and Mr. Hopkins talked about this a little bit. Looking in hindsight, there was more information.
Yes, we now know there's a lot more information.
You might look at things differently looking in hindsight.
I would 100% look at things differently.
But the information that you had on that day, at that time, is what led you to make the decisions that you made and feel the way that you felt about the situation that you were presented with in Mr. Hopkins' office.
That's a fair statement, yes.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Thank you. Briefly, Mr. Ejak, let's talk about the information not shared with you at 10:52 a.m. on November the 30th, 2021. Okay, so you formed your belief that you did not have the requisite level of suspicion to search the shooter's backpack based upon what you were told. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Did James Crumbley tell you that he had bought his son a 6-hour 9mm firearm 4 days before that meeting?
He did not.
Okay. Did anybody, either his son or his wife, tell you that?
No.
Did his son tell you that, or did James Crumbley tell you that his son had been begging for a 9mm handgun?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that he actually got him a different firearm in June of 2021?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that the details and severity of his son's friend being taken from him at the beginning of the month?
No.
Now, you indicated that as far as a discipline standpoint, your belief was that the mental health concerns would override.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So when you have a student who is being seen for mental health, and there also are some minor violations, this being a second day of insubordination, essentially, the mental health concern is what takes precedence because you want to build that relationship with the student and let them know that it's a safe space, and you don't want to follow it up with some kind of a negative interaction, such as a discipline.
Is that one of the reasons why Mr. Hopkins led the meeting?
Yes.
Okay. Did your lens ever change from mental health to discipline?
It never did, no.
And is that based upon the information that you learned that day?
Yes.
Did James Crumbley ever tell you that the 6-hour 9mm handgun that he bought for his son was kept unlocked in the home?
No.
You were asked about certain indicators in your experience when you consider discipline. Is access to an unlocked firearm, is that an indicator?
Yes.
Is that something to consider, had you known that?
It would be something to consider.
Okay, but that information was not shared with you.
No, it was not.
Now, just so we're clear, sir, the information that you and Mr. Hopkins were told on November the 30th, that information wasn't shared with anybody else in administration, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Very brief request, Your Honor. Very brief. Mr. Ejak, you don't know whether James Crumbley knew that his son had access to a firearm that was in the home. Is that correct? You don't know whether James Crumbley knew.
So the question was he told that?
I don't know how he would know what the defendant knew.
He
Unless
testified
he was told.
what he was not told, Judge. That was the question.
Yeah, he said he wasn't told, but I don't know how he would know what your client knew unless he had a conversation about that.
Thank you. You don't know whether Mr. Crumbley's son had expressed any sadness over his friend moving to his parents, based on the information that you had on November 30th.
Can you say
Yes,
that?
it was kind of a
Are you
convoluted
asking
question.
whether it was discussed in that meeting, or?
Whether Mr. Ejak knew that Mr. Crumbley's son had expressed any of this sadness that they had identified to his parents prior to that meeting. Do you know if he did?
I'm not sure what you're trying to ask. I'm sorry.
Yes. Do you know if James Crumbley was aware of this sadness that you all had identified during this meeting with Mr. Hopkins?
I do not know.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Was the information that was shared from Sean Hopkins regarding the emails that he received?
Yes.
Okay. And he went through the drawing with James and Jennifer Crumbley?
Yes.
And at no point did James or Jennifer Crumbley ever say that the firearm purchased 4 days before mirrors the firearm drawn on that math worksheet?
They did not.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right, you can step down and excuse. Your lunch is in. Come back. This spot is wrong, obviously. If I were taller, it would have been fixed already. I'm going to ask you to return at 1 o'clock. It's not about 5 to 12. I'm going to ask you to return at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you not to discuss the case with each other or anyone else. Don't look at any news media. Don't talk to anybody. Don't Google anything. Don't do any research on your phone or anything like that. Any questions about the case now? Okay. All right, we'll see you at 1 o'clock.
All rise for the jury.
All right, you may be seated. Who's the next witness?
We're going to find out. I just spoke with counsel about that, and we'll let her know as soon as we know.
Okay. All
Thank
right,
you,
I'll
Jim.
see you at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.